All right, Matt Taibbi, thank you for being with us on the American Experiment podcast. Let's start by talking just a little bit about your background. You are a journalist by profession, right?
I am, yes. And I'm from a family of journalists. My father was a news reporter for a long time on NBC. And my stepmother was also a business anchor at CNN. So I grew up around newsrooms my whole life.
And you've written for a number of publications. I know Rolling Stone for one. What are some of the others?
Yeah, Rolling Stone is the main publication that I wrote for in the United States. I worked for them for a little over 15 years. Had one of the iconic jobs in American journalism, which is covering presidential campaigns for Rolling Stone. That was the beat that was made famous by Hunter S. Thompson. I've also written for a variety of publications here in the States and abroad. I lived in the former Soviet Union for about 10 years. At the start of my career, wrote in both English and in Russian for a number of publications, including the Moscow Times, which is an expat paper, and then I had my own paper called The Exile there for a while.
And I think you have always described yourself and continue to describe yourself as a liberal. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was very politically liberal most of my life. I've never voted for a Republican in an election. I would probably even say that compared to most people, for most of my life, people would have described me as even more liberal than most liberals. Like I was a member of the Green Party at one point, for instance. So yeah, I've been very politically liberal, anti-war, very sort of aligned with the ACLU for many years on speech issues, and yeah, at Rolling Stone, that's a very politically liberal magazine, always had been, and I never had any issues there while I was reporting.
So at some point toward the end of 2022, you got involved in what has become known as the Twitter files in your capacity as a journalist. And the first question I've got is, how did that happen? Did Elon Musk call you on the phone, or how did that come to be?
Yeah, the exact procedure of how that came to be is a little bit in the area of it's a little, I have to leave it a little hazy because of the sourcing and attribution situation. But basically, the company and Elon invited me to come and participate in something. Now, they were in the middle of an ongoing dispute with, I would say, the news media, which was portraying Elon Musk in a certain light, the new management of Twitter in a certain light. There was a lot of pressure surrounding his acquisition of the company, and I think the Twitter files were an idea that was conceived by the new management of Twitter to restore some public confidence, hopefully, in this idea that the company was being transparent about its censorship or de-amplification policies, by opening up its old internal correspondence to the public, which I think is unprecedented in corporate history, as far as I know.
And you are one of several journalists that got access to Twitter's files. I'm going to talk in just a minute about how you did that. But I know Barry Weiss was another one. I think Alex Berenson got involved at some point, and I believe there were one or two others as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was the first person on, and then Barry Weiss, who's now at the Free Press, used to be at the New York Times. She was the second person invited, and then Michael Schellenberger, who now runs a site called Public, was actually a candidate for governor of California. He was another major figure in this event. There were a lot of people kind of came in and out of reporting on the Twitter files over the period of about 3 months. I actually wrote the majority of the actual reports, but there were probably a dozen different journalists involved at different times.
And how did it work logistically? Did they just give you electronic access to a lot of documents, and did you do word searches, or how did it work?
The logistics are very hard to explain because the situation kept changing over time. So For instance, in the first Twitter Files report, I was just handed a batch of documents that pertain to a subject that I had asked about, which was the decision by Twitter to block access to the New York Post's expose on Hunter Biden's laptop. After that, there was a moment where we had basically laptop access to Slack conversations for about an 8-month period of time in Twitter's history before and after the 2020 election. That produced, I would say, the lion's share of the raw documentation that we got throughout the entire project. After that, it was a different system where each of the journalists had to submit individualized searches that would be cross-referenced against various databases and terms and that sort of thing. It kept changing in subtle ways throughout the entire period, so it's hard to explain. But basically, in the end, we ended up with big piles of documents once every couple of weeks.
And obviously what you were researching here and what you uncovered, as the world now knows, was this period in which Twitter was collaborating with various government agencies really to implement a system of censorship. And it turned out that a number of other social media companies were doing similar things. And before we jump into some more specifics, I guess I'd like to just ask you, in your mind, how would you characterize the most important revelations that came out of the Twitter files?
Well, if you want to look at it from a traditional sort of breaking news standpoint, I would say the biggest stories had to do with us nailing down, for instance, the system of communication that existed between the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, about 24 different tech companies, including Twitter, Facebook, and Google, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. They not only had regular meetings, they had a system that involved flagging requests and sending them to each one of these companies. They had regular communication flow back and forth. We identified all of that stuff and showed exactly how the process worked and in what direction the information flowed and that sort of thing. I think that was the headline revelation. That and things like, Barry's report on shadow banning and how that worked. I think that was I had a story about something called Hamilton 68, which was a think tank that had been basically inventing news about Russian bots that flowed into hundreds of news reports over the course of years, and that turned out to be fake, as we found in the documents. So there was a lot of stuff along those lines. I can get into some of the bigger picture ideas that have only recently come into relief, because that, I think, is going to end up becoming the more important consequence of this research. There was a lot of stuff that we just couldn't get to at the time because it wasn't clear, and we're only starting to understand it.
Well, let's talk about that. What do you have in mind there when you talk about the bigger, the more consequential stuff?
So a lot of the early work that we did on the Twitter files, if you're a lawyer, you understand this. You're looking at a gigantic pile of documents that maybe you've gotten in discovery. You don't know anything. You're looking at all kinds of references, acronyms, agencies, names that you don't recognize. So you have to spend months and months just identifying who the people are in these communications and what context they could possibly be talking about. And that takes quite a while. So it took a long time for us to figure out, this is the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force. They're coordinating with the Homeland Security's Countering Foreign Influence Task Force. There is an NGO that's related to them called CIS. They're coordinating with a DHS committee called CISA, which just adds an A to it at the end. So there's this whole gigantic complex of governmental organizations, law enforcement organizations, intelligence agencies. Then there are NGOs, there are civil society organizations. Then there's the news media. There's a whole gigantic mix of characters. And it took us a long time to figure out who they all were. And the biggest story in the end, I think, turned out to be, and we started to notice this over time, that a lot of these organizations that are supposed to be providing checks on each other, like, for instance, the news media against government, or corporate organizations are supposed to sometimes push back against regulatory initiatives. They were all actually cooperating in what one of the actors called the shared endeavor of censoring basically the general public. And that is a total corruption of how democracy is supposed to work. These groups are supposed to be checking each other's influence, and instead they were coordinating to create essentially a kind of subterranean bureaucratic state. This is very hard to explain, but I think it's a very powerful, scary story that was under the surface of these documents, and we're only just kind of now putting together how all that works.
Matt, I haven't read all of the emails and other documents that you and others have brought to light, but I've read a lot of them. And what is really striking to me, probably more than anything else, is the alacrity with which these employees of the social media companies like Twitter were very happy to collaborate in this censorship project. I mean, it's kind of scary to see how easy it was for these government officials to enlist this private company in their enterprise.
Yeah, that was so. Yeah, there's a tone thing in there, right? That's very strange. Normally when the government knocks on the door of a corporation and says, "Hey, we want you to do this, or else there are going to be regulatory consequences." Normally, internally, what you would expect to see is a series of executives saying, all right, how do we push back against this? How do we make sure that the boundaries are established so that we don't have to, give away the store to the federal government every single time? But instead of that kind of adversarial relationship, which we saw a bit of at the beginning of this process, like in 2016, 2017, it very quickly devolved into an open partnership where essentially all these different government agencies are calling the trust and safety employees at Twitter, and they're just sort of freely associating about which groups they're going to clamp down on today and which themes and that sort of thing. And there's no representation of the people in all this, but there is a very, very tight bond, both socially and professionally, between these executives and the officials in government, where there should be like kind of a barrier between them, and it's just not there. It's also not there between the company and, say, people who worked in news media, right? They would both be collaborating about issues like which kinds of accounts should be taken down, and that as a reporter, that was very odd for me to see the nature of that relationship.
So let's talk a little bit. We're talking basically about censorship here. Certain kinds of communication, certain topics, certain people being censored in this collaboration between government agencies and social media companies like Twitter. There are certain topics that were the main focus of the censorship, right? You mentioned one, which is the information that was contained on the laptop that Hunter Biden left for repairs and for whatever reason never picked up. And that topic, or the suppression of information, because it wasn't about Hunter. Well, the relevant thing there was Joe Biden, right? And the documents on the laptop were important not because they related to Hunter Biden, but because they related to Joe, who at that time was a candidate for president. And a lot of people think that the suppression of that story really played a significant role in the 2020 presidential campaign.
Yeah, it very easily could have played a significant role. And it was very strange, again, to look at the internal discussions about this, because the primary motivation of Twitter, at least internally at the company, was not to have a repeat of the 2016 situation. They were worried about what they called hack and leak operations or hack and dump operations. They'd been warned about this by officials at the FBI. And they were really referring to the 2016 story involving the leak of the DNC/Podesta emails. But as a journalist, I know that that kind of reporting is expressly prohibited, expressly allowed in American journalism. We have Supreme Court cases that say it is allowed for us to publish documents that are stolen, but in the public interest. We do it all the time. They were the basis of countless reports that came out, for instance, during the War on Terror period in WikiLeaks, which was a partner to all these major news organizations. Whistleblowers bring us things that are taken from their workplaces and we publish them, and that's legitimate.
The Pentagon Papers. This goes back a long way.
The Pentagon Papers, exactly. And that's one of the scarier things we found in the Twitter files was a discussion about the reversal of what they called the Pentagon Papers principle. This idea that we should just publish anything that's true, irrespective of the provenance of the documents and or maybe the political purpose of those documents. Again, I was raised as a traditional journalist, which is I'm not supposed to care all that much about which way the facts break. My job is really supposed to be kind of narrowly focused on, is this true? Can I prove that? And if so, I'll put it out there, and then you, the public, you figure out what to do with that information. There is a brand new idea about this that is taking root, which is we have to think about how the public's going to perceive this information. Is it going to cause them to vote for the wrong person? Is it going to cause them to avoid being vaccinated? So they call information that is true but has an adverse consequence. They have a name for it. They call it malinformation, which is a openly Orwellian idea. It's a wrong fact, which is crazy. And we found just countless examples of this in the files.
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting things is that it wasn't just a question of trying to stop the propagation of information that was false, but they acknowledged at times, well, that's true. However, we'd rather people not learn about it. For example, adverse vaccine consequences, that kind of thing.
Right, yes. And that's actually also the basis of the current litigation that's moving kind of steamrolling towards the Supreme Court, the Missouri v. Biden case that's about internet censorship. It's rooted in the experiences of three highly credentialed academics, one from the University of California system, one from Stanford, one from Harvard. And all they were really doing is arguing against lockdowns and saying there are mental health consequences that are bad to all this. They had signed something called the Great Barrington Declaration, which turned out to be right, by the way, as I think most people would now concede. Yeah, exactly. And this is, we can get into the issue of why we don't have a media regulator historically in America. This is one of the big reasons, because truth squads are almost always susceptible to getting things wrong. And in this case, these doctors were de-amplified, blacklisted, put on algorithmic suppression lists because they were advocating against federal health policy. But they weren't wrong. It wasn't incorrect. It was an opinion about policy that was just being suppressed. And it's a violation of the First Amendment, but it's also just a violation of what I would call free speech culture, this idea that we arrive at the truth somehow by freely talking about things. It's a fundamental American idea, and it's just been kind of shoved aside without any debate. And this is another thing that we saw a lot in the files.
So we've talked about two of the main areas of censorship, one being the Hunter Biden laptop, second being several different areas around COVID, including COVID vaccination. What other main topics of censorship did you find?
Well, there was a lot involving Russia. Again, so a lot of these law enforcement and intelligence agencies, their official remit requires them to identify misinformation as having a foreign source. So, for instance, the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, as it's reviewing 2020 election posts on Twitter, it's in their name. They're supposed to be looking for foreign disinformation. But what they do is they basically identify certain themes that they say are in sync with, for instance, Russian propaganda, and they would ask the platforms to suppress or de-amplify that kind of content. So this could be anything from calling for peace talks in Ukraine to denying that certain, that the Mueller investigation was legitimate or was going to bear fruit. It's a whole variety of stuff. And again, there were a lot of these decisions that were made by not just the platforms, but by law enforcement that turned out to be wrong. And Russia was a big actor. They focused on Iran, China, Venezuela. They spent a lot of time trying to connect basically the propaganda initiatives of foreign states to ordinary American social media discourse.
So if the Russians were talking, well, I'm not sure they were doing this, but if the Russians were talking about peace talks in Ukraine and there were Americans on Twitter saying, hey, we should be pushing for peace in Ukraine, that would be identified as being at least consistent with a Russian theme. And I've seen documents where Twitter people are kind of scratching their heads and saying, well, no, we don't have any indication, that these are Russian bots. In fact, they're not. These are domestic sources, and yet the government is trying to suppress them.
Yeah, actually, in one of the most dramatic things that we found, there was a really bizarre episode when the Republican congressman from California, Devin Nunes, had put out a memo basically arguing that there had been corruption of the FISA process during the investigation of Donald Trump with regard to Russian influence. And when he put out the memo, there was a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag release the memo. Now, a number of elected officials, including a couple of senators, put out a press release saying, this is Russian disinformation that's being amplified by Russian bots. And Twitter actually reached out to these elected officials and said, hey, we're not seeing that. There is no Russian bot link that we're seeing. We're not seeing any of that activity at all. This is going to come back to bite you. You probably shouldn't say this. And they were completely ignored. So there were a number of different episodes like that, where Twitter would try to push back gently on news stories like that. But the thing that was kind of disappointing is they never really went public with this stuff and allowed these stories to spread and fester.
So at some point, obviously the Twitter files made a huge splash. There was a lot of attention paid. A lot of people viewed them as being a real revelation. And you were called upon to testify, I know, at least twice in front of congressional committees. Maybe more. I think maybe the first.
Oh no, I was just called once. My colleague Michael Schellenberger he's actually testifying tomorrow. He's gone a bunch of times.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, yeah. Talk about your appearance. What congressional committee was that, and how did it go?
This was a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. It was the House Weaponization of Government Committee, led by Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan.
And what kind of reception did you get from the Democrats on that committee?
Boy, was that weird. Again, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I had always worked with Democratic politicians. I had a lot of friends on the Hill who worked as staffers for Democratic members over the course of the last 20 years. And the reception was beyond hostile. Like, the tone-wise, it was really not at all unlike the House Un-American Affairs Committee hearings from the 50s. I actually had Dan Goldman, the congressman from New York. He's the heir to the Levi Strauss fortune. He was holding up indictments that he had worked on with the Mueller investigation and asking me if I agreed with the idea that Russians were interfering with our election. He was basically asking me to pledge my allegiance to the Russia investigation. And he's a lawyer. I had to try to remind him that indictments are not fact; they're just charges. I can't agree or disagree with it. And but it was like that. It was like, why don't you support this? Whose side are you on? That kind of thing. It was terrifying, and hostile in many other ways too.
And as I understand it, Matt, while you were testifying, one or more IRS agents came to your home, rang the doorbell. Well, tell us about that.
Yeah, so I got home from Washington that night. I live in New Jersey, and my wife handed me a little piece of paper. An IRS agent had come to my door as I was testifying, and basically the note said, "Call me back in 4 days." So apparently there's a tactic. I subsequently found out this is a thing. They want you sometimes to think over the weekend about what it might be that they're calling about, so they don't respond to your queries right away. When I finally did reach them, it was about these very strange. There were two issues. One of them was totally ridiculous, and the other one was kind of minor that they could have dealt with by correspondence. I didn't know any money, but I told the people at the committee that, hey, the IRS came by, and I don't know, this might be like some kind of witness intimidation thing if you want to look into it. And they did. I didn't say anything publicly about it until we got back some information that was kind of upsetting. Specifically that the case had been opened on me on Christmas Eve of the following year, which was a Saturday, and the day that probably the biggest Twitter file story came out. So that was pretty worrisome at that point. It still could be a coincidence. I don't know, but
I don't know.
Good.
Christmas Eve, Saturday. Hard to believe that your tax situation, as you say, didn't even owe any money. Was the top priority at the IRS. There were a lot of government agencies that have been involved in this censorship effort. Along with the social media companies, and they cover really a broad gamut, don't they? What are some of the federal agencies that got into this act?
We're still finding out about all of them. I mean, there's a whole galaxy of these weird committees that the public has never heard of. Obviously, the FBI has a significant presence in just monitoring social media. That's the FITF, which encompasses them, Homeland Security, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. There is something called the Global Engagement Center, which is a new sort of quasi-intelligence wing of the State Department. It's actually not really a State Department entity. It's housed in the State Department, which is a strange distinction. It's a multi-agency task force that has its roots in both state and the Department of Defense. There are other agencies within the Surgeon General's office, the CDC. There's a number of them within the Department of Defense that work on these issues, ranging from DARPA to SOCOM to CENTCOM, which we found was, by the way, creating fake social media bots for deployment abroad. There's just one of these agencies in nearly every corner of the American government, and they're all competing for big, new military-style contracts to do what they call counter-disinformation work, which is really basically mass surveillance and censorship. And this is a ballooning new corner of military contracting, basically.
So I want to talk about the timing of this a little bit. We think of this as something that was unfolding primarily during the Biden administration, but how far back did it go in time?
What we found, and I don't know if this is true or not, but my suspicion, based on everything that I've looked at so far, is that most of the modern roots of what we would call the counter-disinformation movement domestically in America began in roughly the last 2 years of the Obama administration. The transformation that we kept having described to us by sources was something that one person described as CT to CP, which is there was a big infrastructure designed to monitor social media for counterterrorism purposes. So they were looking at social media of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Al Nusra and other groups like that. When those groups stopped being as much of a threat, a lot of that infrastructure shifted over to Russian disinformation and populism, and sort of domestic populism. So that's the shift: counterterrorism to counterpopulism. And Barack Obama, in his last year in office, he founded he signed an executive order founding the Global Engagement Center, which is a counter disinformation agency. The Homeland Security founded the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is the other really big government agency that does this work. That was also the genesis of if you remember, the disinformation, anti-disinformation. I forget what they were going to call it. The one that was going to basically be like a Ministry of Truth that had Nina Jankowicz heading it. That came out of that wing of the DHS as well. But those initiatives both started at the end of 2015, early 2016.
So this is going on throughout the Trump administration. Is there any indication that Trump was involved in it or knew about it, or were they working, on behalf of the Trump administration, against the Trump administration? What did you see there?
The Global Engagement Center, which again is technically a state entity, they were obviously run by Mike Pompeo at one point, who was pretty close confidant of Trump's. We didn't find Trump's fingerprints per se on any documents, although we were told that he had kind of personally written to some of the people at Twitter demanding that this account or that be taken down. But that was more like personal things. He was upset about somebody tweeting about him, and so he sort of rage wrote to somebody at Twitter. The more institutional stuff, yes, there were some Trump officials who were involved. At state, for instance, we saw that a little bit. But really, most of what we were looking at, I would describe as kind of nonpartisan. It's just sort of permanent security and law enforcement officials who are building this capability kind of irrespective of politics. And it doesn't really matter which administration is in power. They're much more interested in sort of expanding capability than in suppressing particular points of view, although that's also happening as well.
Well, one thing we saw certainly during the Biden administration, again, just based on what I've seen of the Twitter files, is the White House got into the act, right? There were White House officials that were engaged in part of this censorship program.
Yeah, that's some of the worst evidence in the Missouri v. Biden case. So you had an instance where for instance, there was a meme that went around that somebody put on Twitter, and it's a joke. It's some guy basically making a joke about the vaccine and saying 10 years from now, you're going to have class action attorneys doing commercials like, if you took the vaccine in 2022, call here, 1-800 whatever. It's a joke, right? The Biden administration was furious. They wanted that down immediately, and there's an email record where they're openly saying, like, this has to come down ASAP, that kind of stuff. And that was very strong evidence of like a direct First Amendment violation. The judges have said as much now. There was a ruling last week calling it that. But it was that. There were some other things that they said, quote unquote, promoted hesitancy that they wanted down right away. They wanted to de-amplify or remove Tucker Carlson's broadcasts. They were very upset that Joe Biden's personal account had been de-amplified inadvertently when he was talking too much about vaccines. That actually triggered an algorithmic response that de-amplified his account. They demanded that be fixed right away. And that's actually, of all the stuff that we saw, the White House letters in the first month of the Biden administration were probably the most ridiculous, I would say.
One question in my mind is, has it stopped? Do you know, can you tell from ongoing review? Are Are these same agencies still doing the same things, or have they backed off as far as you could tell?
No, I mean, I can't say because I'm not there. I'm not looking at, you know, fresh emails that are coming out from any of these agencies. But most of the groups that were doing this kind of work have experienced bumps in their budget since even we started the Twitter files. The FITF, for instance, which at one point had a staff of 80. Last fiscal year, they asked for 88 additional people. They asked for $34 million more. I don't know what they got exactly, but we kept seeing this pattern of asking for more money for all these anti-disinformation programs, both inside the Pentagon and outside of the Pentagon. And my sense is, just from talking to some of the sources and some of the people who are involved in this world, is that it's not only not slowing down, it's accelerating at a pretty rapid pace, actually.
So one of the things that we're seeing is a movement in the courts by a number of parties to try to put a stop to this, as I would say, illegal censorship regime. You mentioned just briefly a moment ago the case where there was a Fifth Circuit panel decision last week. It's Missouri versus Biden. And so far, I think we are seeing the courts willing to look at this kind of unholy alliance and influence and collaboration between government agencies and social media companies, and find that the facts are sufficient to merit a conclusion that it violates the First Amendment. That seems like a hopeful development, doesn't it?
It does. There's a Ninth Circuit case that I think is before the Supreme Court already that is going over some similar. There's some crossover with the Missouri v. Biden stuff in terms of like government Twitter partnerships to censor. But the big case to me is Missouri v. Biden. It has a sort of a broad range of defendants and an expanding list of plaintiffs as well. And the core theory of this case is not just that one body was censored, but that millions of Americans were censored illegally. And already we've had a couple of different courts uphold that decision or that view of the case. The district court judge, Terry Doughty, not only agreed, he issued just an absolutely brutal, sweeping injunction barring basically everybody in the government from talking to any of these platforms, saying it was arguably the worst attack on the First Amendment. I don't forget what the rest of that quote is, but I know that was the core of that quote. The appellate judges in the Fifth Circuit Court, now they pushed back Doughty's injunction somewhat, but they still upheld the core conclusion that the First Amendment had been violated, specifically by the White House, the FBI, the Surgeon General's office, and a number of other executive branch groups. They cut out some other agencies that I actually thought were worse. But for the time being, yes, they've upheld the basic idea that there are mass First Amendment violations going on, which is certainly encouraging. I watched the in-person, like the oral arguments before this last hearing in Louisiana, and the judges not only seemed to believe the case, but they seemed emotionally upset by the evidence, which, as a lawyer, you know that's usually a good sign for your case.
Yeah, that hearing did not go well for the Biden administration and the government agencies.
Definitely not. Now, they didn't deliver on paper as much as they did in that hearing, but I still think it was encouraging overall.
To me, the really key point is there's been this effort, I would say, on the left to erect just a wall and say that if the censorship is being carried out by a private entity like Twitter, like Facebook, like Google, Ergo, there can't possibly be a First Amendment violation, no matter what the background is. And to me, the really important point is that the courts are saying, no, that's not right. There's precedent here. There are legal principles here. There's a certain level of coercion and also just intense entanglement with the government, which if it's there, it violates the First Amendment. And in this case, they found that it was there. And to me, that's the overriding point.
Yeah, and you know what's so strange about that is, I grew up in the 80s when even the idea of private companies putting warning labels, not even like censoring them, but just putting labels on records was such an outrage to liberal America that it was like the number one issue in the country for an entire year. Everybody was rapt with attention watching Frank Zappa and Dee Snider testifying before Congress. We had movies like The People versus Larry Flint, which were about, individual cases, somebody attempting to push back on even a very, very offensive, objectively offensive cartoon. That was unacceptable. Suddenly, those same voters have now become enthusiastic advocates of much more severe and organized and institutionally powerful forms of censorship. And it's, I think, one of the enduring mysteries of American life is how did we get to this place where the same people who, couldn't stand Tipper Gore and advocated for the defendants, the neo-Nazis, to march in Skokie, are suddenly of a completely different mind about the FBI ordering Twitter to de-amplify accounts. I don't understand it.
Yeah, I agree with you. You made a comment earlier I want to kind of close with, and that is that there's the legal aspect, the First Amendment. And we've talked a little bit about lawsuits that are going on. But more fundamentally, there's a reason why we have the First Amendment. We don't believe in free speech because we've got the amendment. We've got the amendment because we believe in free speech.
Exactly.
And that culture of belief in free speech, in open dialogue, in argument, let the facts go where they will. Seems to have been badly eroded, and I think it's fair to say particularly on the left.
Yeah, and again, this is very upsetting for me personally. In my own field, in journalism, the way this first presented itself was when journalists stopped going away from this model of, okay, we'll just tell you the facts, and then it's sort of up to you, the audience, to make sense of that. Our job is just to make sure that we get it right, and then we're upholding our part of the democratic contract here. Your part of it is to evaluate this stuff as citizens. And there was something kind of touching and inspiring about that model, that we believed in it, and audiences believed in it, and they held us to a standard and everything. And suddenly people went away from that, and people in my business started to say, we don't trust audiences to make the right call anymore. We're going to tell them overtly how to interpret facts that they get. We're going to constantly stick words in like lie, without evidence, that kind of stuff in the language of news reports, so that there's not even a temptation to have your own interpretation of facts. You must see things that way.
And we're not going to report things. We're not going to report facts that people might draw the wrong conclusions from. I think that the omission is maybe the most sinister part of the whole thing. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, a classic example being this Hunter Biden story. Like they had a tabletop workshop with the Aspen Institute, where some of the most important political journalists in America were preparing in advance for this story to come out. They had a tabletop exercise where they war gamed the release of a hack and leak story involving Burisma and Hunter Biden. And basically they planned on how to not cover it and how to suppress it, and which is totally alien to what I as a journalist, I always understood. If it's a big story, I don't care. I want to put it out. If it's against the Republicans, good. If it's against Democrats, whatever. That's fine too. It's not my job to worry about that, but they now do. And this is what I was trying to get at before. This whole idea of this kind of shared, managed inflow of information. That's how it works now. And it's antithetical to the free speech culture that we were talking about.
That's a great place to leave it. Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.